Yeah, mostly ready when ready.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the student participants of the clinic, as well as there are lots of other people who have joined us from outside. Of course, our gratitude goes first and foremost to Suraj. Thank you so much for finding time. We really, really appreciate your time. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly introduce the clinic and its mandate, and then pass on the proceedings to Ashish, who will then, of course, go ahead and formally invite Suraj and introduce him. And then, of course, Suraj will speak to us. So just as a quick introduction for those people who are new in the room, the Stateless and Citizenship Clinic is meant to be a year-long clinic specifically focusing on these two themes in contemporary India. And being a clinic, obviously, there are practical sort of issues which we are really interested in, but because of the ongoing pandemic, there are some obvious constraints to where we can go and what we can do. So what we are doing at the clinic for this semester and in all probability the next semester is to focus in a workshop mode on the issues of statelessness and citizenship in dialogue with practical, social, legal, empirical analysis, as well as exploring options of litigation around some of these issues. Specifically this semester, we are looking at questions of citizenship determination in India and the questions of legality around it. So we're really excited for all of you to have joined us here. In particular, what we're excited about is the fact that Suraj is talking to us today. It's wonderful. It's a great topic, an important topic generally, and definitely for the students of the Statelessness and Citizenship Clinic. One of our aims really is to make this into a space of conversation and dialogue for colleagues, not just at Jindal, but also outside. So that is exactly what we hope to do in this event. And hopefully you will join us subsequently also when we invite other guests. So let me invite Suraj, let me thank Suraj for accepting our invitation and pass on the conversation to Ashish.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to Suraj, obviously, for accepting our invitation and being here with us. Suraj, as most of us know him, studied law at LSE and SOAS, and then was a human rights fellow during his LLM at Columbia University. And he's worked at UNHCR and Amnesty International. He was also a legal advisor to the Immigration and Protection Tribunal in New Zealand. And he's also had extensive experience working with the UNHCR in Turkey and in Egypt. And of course, as many of you would know about Australia's offshore immigration detention facility now closed at Manus Island, Suraj was also there helping refugees. So it's a tremendous amount of work that Suraj has done in the area, and we're very grateful that he's here to tell us about his experience and to enlighten us about the topic, about how refugee law plays out in India and the recent developments that they've been in our laws which affect refugees. So thank you very much, Suraj, and over to you.
Right. First of all, thank you so much, Ashish and Mohsin, for inviting me to the clinic. I've heard so much about the clinic, particularly from Ashish, and it sounds like a bit of a passion project and, doing such important work. And there are some familiar faces here, students who've been auditing my class. So hi, students. I think I was quite prepared and wasn't feeling nervous at all. But then I saw some of the names, and I believe Professor Chimney is there, which I think... I hope I do justice to this subject, Professor Chimney. Thank you so much for attending. There's some slides with some of your work here, so feel free to jump in if I'm misquoting you or misinterpreting what you've said at all. So when I was preparing for today's lecture, I realized it's such a vast topic, incoming and outgoing flows. And in the refugee law elective that we do, I mean, we cover it over like 3 weeks. So this is going to be a very condensed version. And I also realize many students might not have a background in refugee law. So we're going to kind of give you like a basic introduction very quickly. So you're familiar with that first. And then we're going to move on. So the lecture is going to be divided into three parts, okay? First part, I want to talk a little bit about global refugee regimes, as they're known as. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the 51 Convention, the 67 Protocol, India and the 51 Convention. But first of all, I'd like to start off with a little discussion maybe about refugee narratives and images which we see. Then I'm going to talk about refugees in India. So a bit of an overview of some of the different populations. Shashi Tharoor's Asylum Bill, which is something I came across actually quite recently. So we don't have an asylum law in India. And I think this is one of the better bills. So I thought it'd be worth analyzing. A little bit about the Citizenship Amendment Act, and needless to say, some of the issues there. And then I want to get to Rohingya in India, because I feel like this is a population which has been particularly targeted. And finally, I think probably my most comfortable area, which I've been working on recently, which is refugee claims by Indian nationals, right? And is there an emerging refugee profile, refugees who are facing persecution, which is linked to Hindu nationalism, the rise in Hindu nationalism, okay? So that's a little bit about the structure. Let's get started. And feel free for this part of the lecture to use the chat box. When we talk about images that we see in the media with refugees, what's sort of the first thing that might come to mind? Anyone? Chat box. Helpless, yes, Navya. Anything else? Okay. Well, look, I think from these images, you can see that, yes, helplessness is something which I think we often see. Victim of circumstances, right? Victim, I think, is a key word that we often see emerging, right? And I think there's this dichotomy between a good refugee and a bad refugee, right? And that's something I want us to question. Are refugees people with agency? Are they people with rights? And what is the intersection between humanitarianism, which you can argue has its roots in colonialism and a colonial project, and human rights, right, when it comes to refugees? And yeah, specifically how refugees are often expected to fit into this mold of victimhood, okay? They're coming to take others' jobs, right? Yeah, I think if a refugee doesn't fit into that narrative, what happens then? What if a refugee exercises agency? Do we talk enough about refugee resilience? From my experience working with refugees, I found them to be incredibly resilient. And I feel like this is something which is overlooked, often, particularly in the decision-making process. And not usually from the global north. Thank you for mentioning that. So I'm going to provide you sort of an overview of forced migration globally. And I know, Professor Chimney, there's a bunch of issues with the terminology there and how it's been applied and the focus on it. But what I want you to take away here is that the majority of refugees in the world today are based in the global south. And they come from specific countries. 57% are from Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan, okay? And to give you an indication, we often talk about Europe's refugee crises, right? But where are the vast majority of the refugees? They're in neighboring countries. We need to look at the demographics of places like Lebanon to understand this and how populations have drastically changed. So there's Germany there, if you can look at the final sort of graph, Germany, which has had, I guess, the bulk of refugees in Europe, is nowhere close to Turkey, right? And of course, Turkey's got a bigger population, but when we talk about Lebanon, for example, Jordan, really, really changing the demographics. So when we talk about responsibility for refugees, who is sharing this responsibility and how is it being shared? Um, I hope some of you might be familiar with Tendai Achiume's work, which has really, really inspired me a lot. And this is from a 2017 paper. And when we talk about responsibility sharing and complicity, I think we need to talk about the role the global north has in contributing to refugee flight, all right? So she cites examples of Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia, and how multiple sovereigns are involved, right? And refugee law is framed in such a way that it focuses on state persecution, right? Often the inability or the unwillingness of a state to offer protection to a refugee. But what about external factors, right? And of course, I've used an image here, which I think many of you might be familiar with, but it doesn't have to be invasion. What about economic factors? What about international institutions, right? These are some of the questions that I want you to go away from today's lecture thinking about, okay? So again, with this intersection between humanitarianism and human rights, many of you who have taken human rights will be familiar with Mutsua's work, right? And the savage victim savior complex. So what he says is the Human Rights Project is well-meaning but Eurocentric. And I think when we talk about the debates and the discussions, the negotiations surrounding the Refugee Convention, this is very, very much clear. This is an image from the discussions, and needless to say, it's pretty evident what the dynamic is and the composition of those who are involved in these discussions. So the Refugee Convention initially had a geographic and time limit, okay? So it was supposed to be limited to European refugees from before the 1st of January 1951. So essentially World War II refugees, right, based in Europe. India and Pakistan could participate in discussions, but states like Nigeria had to seek permission from the UK, okay? And that's just, that clearly there were voices missing in the start of this global refugee regime. And there are many refugees who were excluded or had to have separate frameworks. I think a key example are Palestinian refugees, right? It's not that all refugees were from Europe or were as a result of World War II. This was not the case at all. We've got refugees from the Korean War and partition refugees. And that's that's going to bring me to my next point. India and Pakistan's response to the 1951 convention, right? In those initial discussion phases. So India and Pakistan are not parties to the Refugee Convention. And students, you would have been forwarded the Pia Oberoi reading, right? And I think what she seems to suggest is during those discussions, initially they were very enthusiastic as newly independent states. But as the negotiations around the convention progressed, they ended up being disillusioned. So when it came to the vote at the UN General Assembly on the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, India abstained and Pakistan voted against, okay? And to give you an idea of some of these dynamics, the US delegate, in a conversation with a Pakistani delegate, expressly said that he did not want to sign a blank check, right, to countries in the global south. They did not want to provide humanitarian aid. And in many ways, this excluded India and Pakistan, who had their own refugee flows as a result of partition, right? And there was a suggestion for a proposal at one point that Pakistan would have to, and India would have to provide some sort of financial assistance to refugees in Europe, right? While not receiving the same assistance because of these limitations, right? So you can just see the origins, I hope, of this framework. Okay, let's talk about the Refugee Convention and what it means to be a refugee. And I think there are a lot of myths around this. But essentially, it's a well-founded fear of persecution, which a refugee faces on the basis of race, religion, nationality, membership to a particular social group, or political opinion. All right. According to Hathaway, who's a leading refugee law scholar, persecution, it's not really been defined, but it's been interpreted in some jurisdictions as serious/systematic human rights violations with a lack of state protection. A key right here is the right to non-refoulement, right? Which is essentially, to simplify it, is sending refugees back, to places where they would face persecution on one of these grounds. I hope everything's clear so far. Okay. It's all good? Okay, great. So 1967, folks, Rebecca, you should know, I feel. What was happening around this time? You can type it out. Any ideas? So, I mean, we're in the middle of Cold War politics, essentially, right? And yeah, thank you, Vinay. And of course, the whole, refugee regime has been politicized from the start, right? So it made sense for states to want to open up and take away the time and geographic limits, right? So that results in the 1967 protocol. But despite that, India and Pakistan still have not acceded to the convention. So this is a quote from R.K. Nehru, who I think was in a meeting with the UNHCR regional representative. And he talked about the politics of that time, right? And how the refugee regime was being politicized. UNHCR, help refugees from the so-called non-free world into the free world. We do not recognize such a division of the world, okay? So the relationship with between UNHCR and the Indian government, for example, has been, it's varied at different stages and different times. But there's definitely been moments of tension, and this is something that we need to sort of be conscious of. Okay, and here's a quote from Professor Chimney. So Professor Chimney arguing whether we should accede to the Refugee Convention, right? And I fully support this quote. Any talk of accession should be linked with the withdrawal of measures which constitute the non-entree and temporary protection regimes. That is to say, the countries of the region should collectively argue considering acceding to the convention only if the Western world was willing to withdraw those measures which violate the principle of burden sharing and instead practice burden shifting, right? So again, if we link this to what Achiume has argued, many of the refugee flows are as a result of other actors beyond the state of origin of the refugee, right? And why is it then that the vast majority of refugees are within neighboring countries? So that is a question that we do need to ask. Okay, so let's move on to a little bit of a breakdown of refugees in India. Okay, so these are some statistics from the UNHCR. This should be familiar to many students. When we think of refugee populations in India, so large numbers from Tibet, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Afghanistan, others. So others could include Iraqis, Iranians, Somalis. So it depends on, each group has a different regime, right? And some groups fall under UNHCR's mandate within India, right? But UNHCR's mandate is actually quite questionable because they have an agreement with the UNDP, which is quite, it's not a formal sort of agreement in that sense. And in terms of Tibetans and Sri Lankans, can anyone think of any of the reasons which India might be willing to accept large numbers of Tibetans and Sri Lankans? Any thoughts? Yeah, again, it's political. Well, Hindu slash Buddhist, right? But I think, again, within, when we talk about Sri Lankans, there was a period of time post the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. It's been seen, it really depends on the political context and the time. But post the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, there was, there was many Sri Lankans were voluntarily repatriated, right, to Sri Lanka, and it's been questioned whether that was really voluntary, okay, and there were concerns about security here. So again, these are the countries we've supposedly been welcoming refugees from, but there've been periods of time where there've been issues. With Tibetan refugees, again, I think, so Vinay says morality is dead on the political landscape. Thank you for that comment, Vinay. So with Tibetan refugees, one thing I do want to ask is, of course, it's a good example, right, when you compare it to the others. But for me, there's a little bit of hypocrisy here, right? Why hasn't similar approaches been adopted to other populations, right? For example, Uyghurs. Okay, and that's something that I think we should think about. Okay, so what is the current framework like? So the key legislation is the Foreigners Act, right? And there's not really a distinction which has been drawn between aliens, illegal migrants, and refugees. India does not have a refugee law. Yeah, India does not have a refugee law. Which brings me to Tharoor's Asylum Bill, right? Which was in 2015. I believe this was amongst 3 bills during the same year. But comparatively, I think this was seen as one of the better bills, or if not the best bill. So again, I'm just focusing on the definition, but there's some interesting observations here. And to go back, actually, Tharoor says the bill, if enacted, will put India at the forefront of asylum management in the world, which I would question, and which others have also questioned, when it comes to implementation particularly, right? If it was to go through, which it did not. So I think some key differences, for example, which you might notice between this definition and the Refugee Convention definition, is you've got sex, which has been included, right? We need to think again, who was drafting the law? Who was drafting the definition in the Refugee Convention, right? And since then, there have been many gender-based claims. So I think this is an important, an important recognition of that. And also ethnicity, right? And the difference between race and ethnicity, race is a social construct, and ethnicity is more close to, to cultural and social sort of characteristics, right? In many ways, I would say it's a more appropriate term to use in some contexts. But part B of the definition, I think, is really interesting because it draws from the OAU Convention, which is based, which was, it's for Africa and African states, right? So anyone who's left his country owing to serious, indiscriminate threats to life, physical integrity, or freedom resulting from generalized violence, or events seriously disturbing public order. So it's much broader, right, in a sense, and perhaps more, more in touch with refugee flows in the global south. What you might notice for those who have taken the refugee law elective is there is a difference. You don't have any mention of external aggression, for example, right, which has been taken out. So in that definition, there is a difference, right? And some folks would say, I've read scholarship on this, which argues that external aggression is not something which is really relevant in an African context anyway. I'm not too sure. What do we count again as aggression, right? I would say that if you interpret that broadly enough, there are other parties and other actors clearly involved, right, in domestic issues. So I've already got a question. Yeah, so Preetha says, right, hi Preetha, rightfully says that it's not specific on, it's not specifically focused on persecution. So I've already got a question. Would the word indiscriminate not make this narrow and not wider? It would be wider, right? Because it's talking about situations where it doesn't have to be linked to persecution, as Preetha is saying, right? It can be indiscriminate. There are many refugees who might not meet that convention definition because they've got to link it to a convention ground, for example, right? And so it is broader, I would say, and more inclusive. Okay, so let's move on to the Citizenship Amendment Act. So this is a tweet from our Prime Minister saying that the bill, I mean, this is regarding the bill is in line with India's centuries-old ethos of assimilation and belief in humanitarian values. It's interesting how this argument has been used by different political parties, right, for different purposes. So, you know, in countering it, it's also been used, right? The argument that, no, it's based on humanitarianism and not actually, it's not supposed to be divisive. But I want to go through some of the provisions of the CAA. Okay, I'm just going to give you a couple of secs to go through it if you haven't already. Have you folks covered this already in class?
No. Go ahead, Suraj.
Go ahead. Okay, just have a look and just notice what's in bold, right? Okay. All right, I hope everyone's got a chance to look at that. But some things I want to emphasize, right? Notice that, you know, there are various religious communities who are included. We've got that date, 31st December 2014. What's that about? And exemptions have been granted to northeastern regions of India, right? So does the CAA essentially, you know, count as a refugee law? It's been argued as a refugee law with a basis of hate, right? And that's the reading which I forwarded you. It's based on hate. You can have various views on it, as my students in my class will tell you. But there's some questions that I want to ask you when thinking about the CAA. And I think a key aspect of why I would say it's not a refugee law is because it jumps those basic protections and rights, right? It goes straight to citizenship for particular individuals. But here's some questions I want to ask you. Assuming the CAA is indeed concerned about persecuted minorities, who is left out? Can anyone think of any examples? So for me, if the CAA was concerned with persecuted minorities, to give you an example, Ahmadis from Pakistan, right? I think that's a clear example. Second question, does it assume that every religious minority in the specified countries is subject to persecution? I think that's a little bit what the language is suggesting. then what about refugees who flee from the specified countries on other grounds? What implications does the CAA have for refugees and other refugee populations in India? And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to Rohingya in India. And why is the date 31st December 2014 key? So from the Dhawan piece, he clearly says that it's again to do with politics and who came into power in 2014. But, I've heard other arguments as well about security, very vague arguments about security from government sources. So I'm not really convinced what the reason is, right? And the exemption for northeastern states, simply if we are to go with Dhawan's article, appeasement. Okay, so we'll get to questions in a little while, actually. But again, I do want to focus on groups who have been left out. And there are other groups as well, right? What about, if this is about religion, what about Sri Lankan Hindus then, right? Even if you are to make that argument. Sri Lankan Tamil Hindus. So I came across this article, which I thought was pretty interesting. What happens is, so in this article, it's alleged that Rohingya refugees are converting to Christianity to take benefit of the CAA. And I think this was in some sort of business paper. And religious authorities were calling for more scrutiny on these conversions. Yeah, but again, the question would be, when did they enter as well? And how do you even go about testing that, right? If someone actually, and for those familiar with refugee law and refugee cases, it can be really, really tricky to determine, to test if someone's conversion is credible. So I wanted to, focus on Rohingya because I feel like they are amongst the most persecuted groups in the world. And thank you for that, Ranjeev. Hazaras from Afghanistan, which are a Shia minority, absolutely, yeah. So there are many groups who have been left out. I mean, these are one of the many things that you can find wrong with the CAA. But yeah, there's been a lot of talk from the CAA with regard to Rohingya refugees specifically. And I think this is reflected in the second quote from Jitendra Singh, right? He says that the CAA has been implemented in Jammu and Kashmir. There are no ifs and buts by the implementation. What would happen here is that the next move would be in relation to the deportation of Rohingyas. So for me, what this means is you're pitting refugees against each other, essentially, right? And putting a hierarchy to the harm that they face. But again, when we talk about Rohingya and when we talk about genocide and folks being stripped of their nationality, their citizenship, these are serious things. And the treatment in India is really unfortunate, to say the least. So Kiran Riju also makes a remark regarding Rohingya refugees. India is not a signatory for refugees, so he's talking about the Refugee Convention here. We have been soft. We will facilitate their return. So he's talking about Rohingya again in this context. And again, why so much debate and discussion around Rohingya refugees specifically? We need to ask that. And we need to, there are various aspects to it. Of course, there's religion. But there are all sorts of stories which have been floating around about Rohingya refugees. This alleged ISI threat, which has not been, or links to ISI, which has not been founded yet, right? There's not been solid evidence to back that up at all. One thing that I want you to be sort of critical of is, if you aren't already, is social media and hate speech, specifically against Rohingya people. And here's a link to an article which I found really interesting because it was discussing what role Facebook has in preventing hate speech, right? And false news surrounding Rohingya refugees. I think the article kind of summarizes, ends by saying that, if you've got these broader beliefs and ideas, Facebook can do what they want, but they'll still remain, right? So that is the situation. But social media has sort of been key in the targeting of Rohingya refugees and this debate around forced debate, not only debate, and implementation around forcible returns. Yeah, so a key, there are various arguments to forcible returns which have been made, including the fact that India is not, has not acceded to the Refugee Convention, so non-refoulement does not apply to India. But again, that's questionable because you could argue easily that it's something under customary international law, right? And India has signed on to other conventions, right? Which does, where it is included. But I found this interesting article in The Wire regarding some cases, some arguments which have been made about the security argument. So the CGI said, "We are not going to be swayed away by emotions. We will go strictly go by the law. We will not permit any emotional arguments. We're treating the issue holistically, and we are giving we're thinking how to strike a balance." So he's talking about various different considerations, interests, national interests such as economic interests, labor interests, security concerns. So there's a whole bunch of factors, right? But again, what about the risk of harm which Rohingya would face, right? As I would say, one of the most persecuted groups in the world. I feel somewhere in all these debates and discussions, this has been sidelined, and there have been forcible returns since, right? And what's really concerning is in our last refugee law class, we had a Rohingya activist who spoke to us, and what he pointed out was many Rohingya are actually going back to Bangladesh, where the conditions are far from ideal. So I think that would give you an indication of the situation in India today when it comes to Rohingya refugees. All right, so to our final part, which is Indians claiming asylum and Indians being recognized as refugees. So students, I'm curious, do you think there are any particular profiles of Indians who would be likely to be accepted as refugees based on the definition, the 1951 convention definition we covered? Are there any particular profiles? So traditionally, there have been all sorts of groups who have been accepted, right? And the limitation here is in terms of access to case law, the vast majority of refugee judgments are not published, right? And they're often focused in a few global north countries, right? So that's an issue that we have. So we don't perhaps know the full picture. But Imran Khan in Geneva in 2019 argued that the biggest impending refugee crisis would be from India. Okay, and to support this argument, he cited various developments in India, including the CAA, stateless people left out of the NRC, the revocation of Article 370, and the lockdown in Kashmir. And he suggested that Indian Muslims would leave the country and flee to various countries, including Pakistan. Okay. The Indian delegation in Geneva was swift to dismiss this, and they said it was alarmist. And perhaps at this point, there's no indication that there's going to be a large flow. But with the way things have been panning out in the country, these sort of claims have been recognized. Folks fleeing due to developments in India and recent developments. Okay. So when we talk about refugee claims from India, like traditionally, India hasn't had many refugees who've been accepted in other countries, right? But this is on the rise. The number of folks seeking asylum and the number of folks who've actually been recognized as refugees is on the rise. And again, these are small numbers comparatively, but it's something we need to be conscious about given the current developments in the country. So in 2018, between 2016 and 18, there was a 46% increase in the number of Indian asylum seekers, right? And actually that should be 2016. So between 2016 and 18, there was a 24% increase, okay? So the numbers are definitely going up, even if you consider them to be relatively small comparatively. The vast majority of Indian asylum claims are rejected in various jurisdictions. To give you an example, in Canada, there were 6,381 asylum claims. Only 352 were accepted, 512 were rejected. Okay, the others are pending. But in Australia, you can see that there is an 8% acceptance rate. So it's pretty low when you compare it with somewhere like Turkey or Iran or Syria, right? But before we get into sort of this emerging, what I argue is sort of an emerging profile of refugees from India, let's talk about some of the more common claims that they might have been, right? Or the common profiles. So according to the UK Border Agency's operational guidance note, some of the profiles which they've identified who are not necessarily accepted because they might not be found to be credible or they don't have a well-founded fear of persecution, are Sikh separatists, religious minorities, populations impacted by insurgencies, women at risk of gender-based violence, and LGBT people, okay? And in the United States, there are many Indian nationals who are in detention, you know, at the border in the States who have sought asylum. And a study of them, you know, and the reasons why they fled were really sort of varied and they really intersected. So factors like economic decline, the drug epidemic, environmental degradation, and political violence. Within that 1951 convention definition, the vast majority of these claims would not be accepted, okay? So I'm gonna talk about a little bit of case law now. So with this emerging profile, right, where they've clearly called out the current government. So I'm first gonna start off with a 2018 case from the Immigration and Refugee Board in Canada. And this involved a Muslim man who worked in the beef industry since 1998, okay? He was attacked by 10 men, and he later realized that they belonged to the RSS. He tried to file a police complaint, but they asked for a bribe. These are sort of the rough facts, okay? But look at the last two quotes. I think they're pretty key. Since the BJP party rose to power in India in 2014, cow vigilante groups have become more active, and their actions appear to be tactically and even openly condoned by the government, and by the police, right? So there's a lack of state protection if we're to go by Hathaway's definition. The general climate, this is a quote from me though, which did stand out, right? Which opens the door, I think, for other claims and a broader sort of claim from religious minorities, including Muslims. The general climate in India for Muslims and those involved or suspected of being involved in beef slaughter has significantly deteriorated since PM Modi and the BJP rose to power. And that violence and other form of discrimination against those groups are increasing steadily, okay? So this is a claim which was accepted. Yeah, and again, you know, when you look at the language which they've sort of adopted, there's a clear link. They're not isolating vigilantism from, you know, religious intolerance towards Muslims, right? There's a clear link there. All right, the second case that I want to bring up is an Australian case, the Australian Administrative Appeals Tribunal. Okay, so this involved roughly the facts again. A Punjabi Sikh woman, she'd been previously married, but she remarried and converted to Islam in Australia. She faced discrimination within the Sikh community in Australia, hadn't gone back to India, right? So there was a forward-looking risk that she would face if she was to go back to India. She feared harm specifically from her ex-husband and the family. So the tribunal found that she would face isolation, discrimination, and significant animosity on return to India. And it would be perceived as shameful and dishonorable to her ex-husband and family. And what's interesting in this case particularly is, you know, they're not just saying that she's at risk in Punjab. There's a broader risk for her elsewhere, right, potentially. So the current political climate comes up again. So since the election of the Modi government in May 2014, Hindu right-wing groups that claim proximity to the BJP have stepped up social pressure and violence against interfaith marriages involving Hindus, right? So these factors have definitely, come to play in these decisions. All right, and the final decision is from the Immigration Tribunal. And, you know, I was talking to actually someone from a lawyer, let's say, in India. And he was like, oh, New Zealand will accept anyone, which I think it's one of the more liberal systems, I have to say. And I'm glad I work there as opposed to some of the other systems. There are not always decisions that I might agree with. There was a specific case for those who are coming to the refugee law class after this, involving a Kerala family, which raised some questions for me. But obviously, I didn't have all the facts in front of me. Okay, so this involved basically a gay man whose family had close ties to the BJP and RSS, okay? And the tribunal relied, when they were looking at the risks against LGBTQ people, on an ICJ report which said that there's systematic discrimination, violence faced by queer people in India, right? Okay, that's one level of it, okay? There is discrimination. But then they rely on country information, which again discusses the BJP and their attitudes, right? And this male chauvinistic patriarchal mindset, okay? And there was a specific attack which was, referred to against 12 sex attacks, against sex workers and the LGBT community and moral policing and agencies of conservative Hindutva society. So these are things which have been factored in. Okay, and what's really interesting here is, again, there's often a divide between the law and discrimination socially, right? And again, keep in mind that this is a New Zealand tribunal. This might not have had the same outcome elsewhere. But essentially what they were saying is, regardless of whether, there's decriminalization, there's still a risk for this individual, particularly given the patriarchal mindset of the BJP and their attitudes towards LGBTQ people. So here you're having three different claims. You've got folks involved in the beef industry. You've got LGBTQ people who might have some sort of affiliation through their family with the BJP/RSS. And you've got interfaith marriages, right, involving a Muslim man, okay? So that is where I'd like to leave you with. Do bear in mind, again, that there's a whole bunch of issues with, when I worked at the Immigration Tribunal, I do want to say that it's predominantly white men making these decisions, right? And we can't ignore the fact that they have certain perceptions or, ideas about countries, right? I think they try and be as thorough as possible, right? Especially with country of origin information, but there are limitations there, right? So that's something we need to be wary of. That is a counter argument to the article which I wrote, which I've heard. But I would still say, I think it's just a matter of time. There will be other profiles. What about activists? What about journalists, right? yeah, there are many, I think, folks who will be at risk as as things unfold. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Suraj, for your lecture. It's been wonderful. We got to know a lot. Probably we should open the floor for questions now.
Mm-hmm.
And would you like to take the ones which were typed in the chat during the lecture? Or otherwise, anyone participating, please feel free to raise your hand.
Thank you, Professor Trimini, for coming. Oh my God.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Chimney, for attending the lecture as well on our behalf. But yeah, so please feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. Suraj, shall we go through? Should I read out the questions in the chat?
Sure. Where do I start?
From Shubhangi, I think. You took the ones before that. So
this is the CAA?
Right. Should I read it out for everyone's benefit?
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah. Shubhangi is asking that the underlying idea of the legislation, that is the CAA, is to offer refuge to those religions who wouldn't otherwise be able to access refuge or asylum in neighboring countries. It is also pertinent to note that the idea was to sort of honor the obligation of India to people specifically from non-Muslim groups who happen to be in these countries after partition. So how would you respond to that, Suraj?
I'm not quite following the question, to be honest. It's a person to note that the idea of honor.
Right. Okay. So Shubhangi is saying that the CAA
are you asking me if I agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, what would be your response if you think that sort of fits in as the Indian refugee law approach, as Shubhangi is saying, that it offers refuge to those religions who wouldn't have access to asylum if they face persecution?
So, I mean, again, my issue here is why are you jumping? I think the first step should be an asylum law, right? Why are we jumping to citizenship? And why are we leaving a whole bunch of folks out? I think that's sort of the key takeaway. I mean, that's my view. I know some folks in class might disagree, and they say that, okay, no, but it's a step in the right direction, right? And there have been arguments made, talking about the Constitution and obligations there. Look, I think that India needs an asylum law. I think that would be my first step.
Right. Thank you. There's another question from unknown user who asks that what would your approach to this swelling problem be? Should you have control over the other factors involved? I'm not sure what this is referring to.
Unknown user, is it possible for you to switch your mic on and ask that question?
Testing. Hello?
Hi.
Testing? Right. Sorry about I'm Vinay. I was kicked out of the webinar, but yeah. The question I had was actually the problem you currently face with immigration and refugees in total. Like, what would your policy approach be to best mitigate the problems on all sides?
Which context? In India?
In an Indian context, or if you were in control of any government, for example, what would your policy approach be?
I think a key thing should be, I think a key focus should be on responsibility sharing, right? And I think that the way that it's sort of been distributed, I think puts an unfair burden, and that impacts the rights of refugees in many countries, right? And that argument can easily be made, right? Things about, okay, no, we are poor countries. I think that there's got to be more, I think there's got to be more of a focus on tackling, these issues. And I think I don't have a simple answer, but I think a lot of the policies towards refugees are motivated by xenophobia and hate. And I think that's a much more difficult thing to challenge, right? And when we talk about the refugee regime, it's been termed the racialized refugee regime, right? And I think there's whether we want to use xenophobia, fear of outsiders, or racism, It really depends on the context, right? But I think in many cases, it's a very, very gradual step. Like I think with the debates in the States now about Black Lives Matter, to give you an example, how long are we going to have how long is it, what is it going to take, right? So I think those are two things: responsibly sharing and very gradually addressing racism and xenophobia.
Right. Thank you. I think we should take 2 or 3 questions together. Thank you, and I hope that answers your question. I'm going to ask Sharon, Arushi, and Nangsel to please unmute one by one and ask your questions, since your questions are very pertinent, and they're also Arushi's question is quite long as well. So Sharon, Arushi, and then Nangsel, could you please unmute and ask a question?
No, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes. So I had a very basic question. I just wanted to know if you think that India should sign the 1951 convention, considering its Eurocentric nature and anachronistic nature. Yeah,
I tend to agree with Professor Chimney. That article was written a while back. I'm curious. I wish he hadn't left. I'm curious what he would have to say now. But if there's been any change at all, I think the priority should be on a national law, a national asylum law. So no, but having said that, I mean, the tricky thing is this: with the forcible returns of Rohingya, you're often having this argument that, oh, we've not acceded to the Refugee Convention, right? But if there was an asylum law which somehow included non-refoulement, which probably wouldn't happen, right? Or quite possibly wouldn't be passed. I think, in the alternative, yes, by all means. But right now, it doesn't look like I think either is going to happen.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Arushi, would you like to go next?
Yes, Professor. Thank you for your presentation. I'm sorry about the length of the question, but so I was asking, since there is an increase in the predicted influx of asylum seekers from India and a fear of loss of protection because they might not fall under the 5 triggers of fear of persecution, would the hybrid law approach used by the Toyota case be of any help? Because as I understand it, initially the claims of refugee status were rejected, but after they used a hybrid law approach with environmental law and human rights law and refugee law in conjunction, then there was an implied justification for protection. So maybe for the asylum seekers that are coming from India, that could be done too.
I mean, I think with climate change, and I believe that was not, I'm not sure, you'll have to ask Cosmin, right, if that was actually a refugee decision. It was a New Zealand decision it was cited in, I believe. But I believe it might have been a deportation decision, if I'm not mistaken.
I took Cosmin Sir's refugee elective, and this is where I learned so it was for a refugee status.
Okay, if it was, I'm not sure, because New Zealand, as you know, has been reluctant to accept refugees even under climate change, right? So I'm not sure if that approach would necessarily work or be extended, into this particular context. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Arushi. Nangsel, would you like to go next?
Thank you so much, Professor, for your wonderful lecture.
Yes.
So my question was, what is the future of the CA and the Muslim refugees, the incoming Muslim refugees? And what about the Nepalese immigrants who were excluded from the NRC in Assam?
So is the future Muslim refugees coming in?
Yes, sir.
Look, I think the Rohingya have been particularly targeted, but I don't think there's a very promising picture, ahead with Muslim refugees. I mean, to give you an example, many Rohingya were given documentation by UNHCR, and that doesn't seem to count for a lot now, right? So, potentially recognized by UNHCR, but still might be forcibly returned. I can't comment, to be honest, on the situation that you mentioned with Nepalese, because I simply don't know enough.
Thank you, Nangsel. Kush had a hand up. Kush, would you like to ask a question? And then Suraj would like to take two questions at once. We can have Kush's question and then Shuchi's question. You could answer both together. Kush, would you like to unmute and ask a question?
Sure. Right. First of all, thank you, Professor, for that wonderful lecture. It was very enlightening, and we have a lot to think about as we proceed for the course. I have two questions. One is something that I've been sort of looking for answers on a personal level. The other, I believe, would be something that we would, as participants of the clinic, benefit from. So the first question is pertaining to refugee narratives and how they embody this sense of being able-bodied, and particularly that seems to have some sense of exclusion for people with certain disabilities, or let's say certain people who are institutionalized. How does this sort of translate into refugee law? And I was hoping if you could perhaps refer to case law or the lack thereof in terms of whether certain persons with disabilities have sought asylum and how their applications and rights have been upheld, even though they may not be explicitly stated. The second question is a rather simplistic one, is with reference to the fact that you've mentioned that we should have a national statute for refugees. I'd like to expand that question further and ask whether there should be a national framework to address the issue of statelessness as well, considering that there is a certain level of disproportionate impact that stateless people might still have, and whether that can be harmoniously addressed in the same legislation, or does statelessness merit its own sort of a statute, its own framework to sort of address, because situations of statelessness and refugees may overlap. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of disability, right, and mental health, and where that falls sort of within refugee law, I think generally the standard, when we talk about standard of proof, right, and the burden of proof with refugee claims, you're expected to give the benefit of doubt to a refugee, right? Because many refugees come into a country with little documentation and little evidence. Trauma, I think, is something which many refugees face, and I feel like this would extend in when it came to disability potentially and mental health, right? So broadly with the guidelines. Are there any specific cases which do come to mind immediately? No. But again, it would be, something I would imagine similar to the proof required when we're talking when in relation to trauma, depending on the disability. But I think the risk sometimes here is potentially infantilizing disabled refugees. That's something which automatically comes to mind, right? And it really depends on the system you're in, who that decision maker is, how they're how they are conducting that interview, and what sort of standard that they're using. Yeah. Oh, and sorry, the second question, statelessness. No, I think statelessness determination procedures, I think in itself is, there's sometimes is an intersection, right, between the two, right? So nationality is one of the grounds. So you can be stateless and you can be a refugee. But I would say, yes, in an ideal world, there should be a separate law in an ideal world.
Okay, thank you, Kush. I'm going to ask Ruchi to ask a question by muting herself. And there are more questions. I would ask you to please raise your hand, and then you can, it would be good if you interact with Suraj rather than posting good questions in the chat box. Yeah.
Or Ashish has to read out the question.
Shuchi, would you like to read your question, or should I?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Thank you for your insights, Professor. My question is that there's an unnerving silence on the genocides of Uyghurs taking place in China, and the silence is seen from not just the world, but like the UN in itself, that refuses to acknowledge that something of this manner has is even happening to begin with.
Yeah.
So my question was, what impact would you think that this silence from the UN would have on the acceptance of the Uyghur refugees to India? And secondly, how exactly would the tensions at the Indian border with China impact this influx of refugees from there and protect them from discrimination?
So I think to the first part of the question, I think, yeah, with Uyghurs, is it, wait, sorry, could you repeat the first part of the question? The second part was about border tension, right?
Yeah. The first part is that what impact would you think that the silence from the UN would have in acceptance of these refugees to India?
Okay, so I think, you know, when we talk about attention, for example, which Rohingya refugees have faced, for example, we've got, we've got now case law, we've got sort of a preliminary decision, you know, using the language of genocide, right? And still we're having hate speech and discussions about forcible returns for Rohingya refugees, right? So in terms of Uyghurs, I think less coverage. It's trickier given the dynamics with China, isn't it? And I think that's traditionally, I would say, one of the reasons why India has not, has not had such a favorable policy to Uyghurs. In terms of elsewhere, it's a very widely accepted claim. Uyghur refugees from the jurisdictions that I've worked in. And the second question was to do with the border dispute. Honestly, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Will it be something that India would want? I don't know. Would potentially aggravate China more? Is that something that they would be willing to do by accepting Uyghur refugees? I would say maybe not. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Shruti. Mohsen has a question as well. Mohsen, would you like to go ahead? Mohsen?
Professor, you're muted.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca, thank you for pointing that out. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Great. So I actually didn't have a question. I had two comments. The first one more in response to Nangsel's question about the Nepalese sort of immigrants excluded from the NRC. The second comment was more about a rather counterintuitive curiosity. And I'll just state it as a comment. And I would be curious about what Suraj thinks about it. So just for the first comment about Nangsel's question about what will happen to the whole range of people who have been excluded, not just the Muslim or Hindu Bengalis, but also the other ethnicities. And as as Suraj pointed out in sort of the main part of his presentation, it's in part actually quite uncertain. And it's uncertain in the most disconcerting of ways. It really depends on what the fate of CAA is going to be. We do not have the CAA rules yet. They have not been formulated. It's up to speculation whether there will be national level CAA rules or will be state CAA rules. So separate rules altogether for Assam and for other states. Perhaps it will be the second because it is easier to sort of localize. And if political instrumentalization is what the government is looking for, which seems to be the case, then it'll be easier to frame them responding to the political necessities. In part, the interesting thing to look out for is, under the CAA rules, what kind of evidentiary requirements will be provided for. So will the people need to show that they are persecuted minorities? What kind of proof will they need to show? As Suraj said, anybody familiar with the refugee law practices would know that it is practically impossible to prove many of these things. What will be the standard? Obviously, for the government, if we are to assume the worst, they would actually require practically no evidentiary requirements. But then the challenge would be something like the conversion question, which Suraj pointed out, right? So what happens if people just stand up and start appealing to the rules? In all probability, what may happen is, depending on the rules, people who basically are not Muslim will be able to file their exemption requests. Another thing to look out for, see, all these are things which I would want us to look out for, is whether the benefits under the CAA rules will be individualized, which is that they will only respond to requests being filed, or whether they'll be en masse exclusion or en masse immunization, which would basically be from a government notification excluding people from the illegal migrant category, or will it be responsive, which is whether government will say you need to submit something. Even that is absolutely unclear. So the kind of uncertainty is quite worrying, and therefore even one of the major reasons why the CA has not been implemented yet, I have a feeling in a major part is precisely because of this, not only because of the political implications in the Northeast.
I think we can't hear more. Mohsin, are you here with us? Oh, maybe Suraj, you could start answering the question if Mohsin comes back, and we'll ask him to finish the latter half. Yeah.
I wasn't sure what. I think it was the second one that he wanted me to comment on.
Yeah. Mohsin, would you like to join back in?
Is there another question? Which?
Mohsin, you got cut off. You were talking about political implications in the Northeast, and you got cut off.
Yeah, I think he's rejoining.
Okay. Well, we should maybe wait for him. I mean, he was just mid-question. Okay, should we maybe take another question meanwhile? Jagatjeet, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, sir. Hi, thanks for the lecture, it was amazing. So I have this question, not a question, but like more an opinion, where I see CA from this perspective, where I say that if like CAA can be judged to be a positive discriminatory law in sense where it actually what it does is it protects persecuted minority religions or people from persecuted minority religions in neighboring Islamic countries. So what it really does is, as if we say from a law perspective, creates a class of people that it aims to benefit as other policies in the do, like reservations or like other things. And should we put it to that same standard as what we put reservation laws and say also for immigration, because it's the similar law and it's our domestic, in sense that domestic laws, and in sense if we can create that reservation as we create here and hence defend CA saying it to be a positive discriminatory reactionary law.
I mean, I don't agree with that, because I think, I mean, for me, religious persecution, right, as more broadly, right, I mean, how do you measure that across different groups, right? You would be prioritizing a few specific groups, right, in this, but I think the focus here should be on persecution. And even if we are going to talk about religious persecution, if we're going to prioritize that over everything else, then what about political grounds? What about gender, for example? What if you are the majority and so I think if we are going down that road, I would say we're going against the ethos of what India is all about. That is what my personal view is. So I don't think it's a positive thing at all.
But can't it also be looked as a stepping stone to start some refugee policy in sense? So like it's a building point of where you start it once and then you move on. If you look from that, I know it's a very, very optimistic perspective, but yeah, you can also look at it from that way.
So, I mean, what I would say again to that is you don't have the basics there yet, right? But you're jumping to citizenship through naturalization for particular groups. And yeah, what I think, sure, if we had those basics covered, then perhaps we can talk about this, right? But we don't even have that. So yeah, but again, even if we had the basics and we started talking about this, What grounds is it? And there are things that, I've heard counter arguments. And again, I feel like this is not my class, so my personal views can come out. You've got, it's not just Hindus, right? It's a whole bunch of religious groups. But for me, it's clearly exclusionary. And that's something which I'm not able to overlook.
Thank you, and thank you, Suraj, for the answer. Mohsin, would you like to finish your question now?
Oh God, I'm really, really sorry about that. I think I went on and on. I finished my question, and then I realized that I wasn't connected anymore. So I have no idea where my question stopped. But just to sort of, sorry.
Political implications in the Northeast.
I have no idea where I was, but basically, to Nansel's point, my my invitation would be look at the CAA rules when they come out, look at what the mechanics are, what kind of evidentiary standards are provided, and whether they're individual responsive rather than carte blanche. And I suppose in each of these cases it'll be the latter, but there's a fair amount of uncertainty, and not only with the Nepalese people, but with transgenders. It's remarkable what kind of uncertainty and precarities exist right now in response to or in the aftermath of the NRC. But very quickly about the comment, I have a feeling that maybe that was what Jagatjeet also raised. But let me sort of frame it as a comment. In my weaker moments, I feel that the well-meaning response, let me just call it the through response, because most of his responses are well-meaning, whatever are the other merits or lack thereof, is a mistake. And the well-meaning response is that, oh, the government is defending this law based on some belief that it is fine, an asylum policy, not perfect, whatever, but at least a start. Therefore, the conversation, we should jump on that conversation and say, all right, let's have a conversation about the asylum law. What appears to me to be the case is that the CAA is not an asylum law at all. It's not like it's a partial asylum law. It's not that it's a bad asylum law. It is actually not an asylum law. It's not a refugee law. It is a citizenship law. The most dramatically interesting thing, and that may be partly also in response to Jagatjeet's sort of point, is that the people who are being given citizenship under the CAA 2019 may have actually already qualified for citizenship, most of them, in the sense that under the rules and orders of the Passport Act and the Foreigners Act, many of the people who suffered from religious persecution from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh were actually technically excluded from the category of illegal migrants altogether. Because in order to be an illegal migrant, you need to be either have violated Indian law or have stayed in India violating Indian law. But both these laws, Passport Act and Foreigners Act, actually immune these groups if they followed certain procedures. So the interesting thing over here is something else. The interesting thing is, despite the fact that the people who are coming in are exempted under Indian law and therefore might not even be illegal migrants, there were other routes available. Why did the government rely on the Citizenship Amendment Act? And it seems to me that the problem which the government wanted to resolve was not persecuted minorities who were coming in. The problem was the people who are already here for generations but do not have citizenship because of the 2003 amendment. So it was really the Assam problem. Now, other people have also raised it. But this comment which I wanted Suraj to just tell me, because it's just as a political strategic matter, was it a mistake, or do you think it is a mistake for the Tharoors to respond and in a way take the bait and say, all right, let's have, if you want to have a conversation about the asylum seekers and refugee law, let's have it. Because by doing that, we allow the government, assuming that we are not sympathetic to the motives of the government, to change the conversation to asylum and refugee, rather than just staying away from that conversation altogether and saying, this was never, and this is not about asylum and refugee law at all. This is about politics, and let's just deal with the politics and discrimination, which is part and parcel of that, if we believe that, rather than participating in a conversation about asylum law and refugee law, which this was never about. So I'm just asking a strategic sort of question, and are we making a mistake?
Look, from what I understand, this is one of many bills, right? And this conversation around asylum law has been going on for a long time. Whether this fed into those arguments or not, it could have been definitely one of the factors. But I hope, what I'm hopeful for is that the debate around an asylum law will not stop. And, I have friends who I know are working on proposals for bills, and I think that is the key. I think what you said earlier for me really struck me, right? That this is not a refugee law at all. And I think that, when we're talking about basic things, right? Like a right to work, right? And documentation, right? This agreement, for example, refugees who do fall under UNHCR, I mean, often their documents are not recognized, right? And what happens then? So I think that's the need for it. Do I think this contributed to that line of argument? The rule, potentially yes, but I mean, I think this debate about the asylum law will continue, and I hope it does and grows stronger. But yes, I think it's unfortunate that the language of this being a humanitarian, something humanitarian is it's unfortunate because it is in many ways, it's justifying, yeah.
Thank you, Suraj. Navya has been, I think, waiting for a while to ask a question. Navya, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, hi, am I audible? Hello?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so hi, good afternoon. Thank you for this session. My question is about the Shashi Tharoor bill, and you had highlighted that he included sex as one of the new grounds for persecution. Yeah. So in terms of your practical experiences working with refugees, and especially refugee women, how important do you think it is to include sex as one of the grounds?
So it's, I think it generally, claims involving gender and women fall under particular social group, right? So, but it needs to be framed in such a way. So as a particular social group, so you've got often an innate characteristic or something which is linking folks within that group together, and together they're at risk of persecution, right? So you've got, I mean, an example would be women who are contravening social norms. I think it's just a matter of simplicity in terms of claims, right? Refugee status determination, the way it's interpreted really depends from place to place, right? Adjudicator to adjudicator. It's narrative based. It's often with a lack of documentation. So given all these variables that are there, I think having something explicit in writing, sex, I think is something which is beneficial. And I think if not, if we are even to use the argument that yes, many women who are facing harm would fall under a particular social group, I think why do we have race? Why do we have political opinion? Why is sex/gender left out? I think just even on a symbolic level, it's something which is important.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Right. I remember we had like a full lecture in my refugee law course at the LSE, where my professor, Professor Bayani, was also, took the same position as Suraj is taking, and we discussed several FGM cases there, and how they were being read into the PSG definition. So we should, I think, now hear from Somajit and then Pritha.
Hello, Professor, can you hear me? Hello, Professor, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Professor, I have a comment and then a question following the comment. So I would like to say that given in terms of the kind of diversity that we have, there are several competing interests that are there. Like I feel that to an extent, there are certain reserved classes as well, where like the government says that these are certain reserved areas for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, or like people from a different particular origin. If you look at the northeastern states, the long-term perspective, there has been the question of cultural sovereignty. Like people coming in from outside would kind of just dilute that entire cultural aspect that they have. And also to an extent, nowadays, if we look into the aspect that economic migrants who come into different countries for the purpose of seeking jobs. So my question is this, that presently we see that different states have already brought in some laws or are in the process of bringing in laws to ensure that their state population, so a person who is living in Madhya Pradesh is entitled to the jobs of Madhya Pradesh, and 70 to 75% reservation is being given out for residents of a particular state. In that case, how do you feel that even in the current scenario where the jobs market is very in a dire state, that how should the states actually should the aspect of economic migrants be taken into perspective in a specially convoluted market? And also the refugee framework, I completely agree that should be a centralized framework, but I feel that the kind of guarantees or the kind of rights that the refugees are supposed to be given, shouldn't it be more states centric? Because different states have different interests and they have different kind of population, and some states, especially in the northeastern states, they would not like to have refugees settling over there. Can you just address this question?
No, I mean, I think that for me, that's I think the risk there is that you'd have completely different standards, right? And I think there's a risk that some states would have rights. I mean, would offer rights to refugees, which other states wouldn't. Even if we were to have that, I think for the sake of simplicity, I would very much like to have a national law. I wasn't too sure about your first question though. Is there a way you can kind of condense it? And it was to do with economic migrants.
Yes, that was regarding the economic migrants, as well as the fact that there are states which like to maintain their cultural sovereignty, allowing migrants would dilute their cultural sovereignty to an extent. That is what the argument is being put forward. Yeah.
I mean,
so what is the?
I feel like look again, and maybe I come from a different perspective. I think that diversity enriches any society. So that's what I would say, but that's my own personal perspective. I think, I think the challenge there is, again, I think many states have different resources and different needs, right? And the moment we start tilting towards an open borders argument, how feasible is that?
Right. Thank you, Somajit. Pritha, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
So I wanted to know how valid the refugee claim be by an anti-CAA protester, given that prosecution has become a means of their persecution?
Yeah, so I think the question with this is a really good question, Pritha. Thank you. As always, Pritha does come for the refugee law class and asks these amazing questions. So I think we need to, when we look at that, there's a difference between prosecution and persecution, right? So if you wouldn't necessarily be a refugee if you're being prosecuted, basically. But we need to look at it in terms of a human rights framework and an international human rights framework. Is it proportional? Is it fair? Are we operating in a fair and just system, right? So I would say with CAA protesters, I think there's potentially a claim there.
I mean, the government may claim that it's completely an internal conflict and should be governed by their internal domestic laws. So, I mean, how would we address something like that?
Wait, but you mean, let's say a CAA protester is risking prosecution in India but goes overseas? Is that what the context?
Right. If they are claiming refugee status in other countries, I mean, it might be a little, dicey because, I mean, because they are being prosecuted under terrorist laws, right? So, I mean, what would their claim hold?
I think again it would be weighed under international standards, right? Because there's a whole balancing test, right, in terms of national laws, right? Because by that logic, right, if there wasn't that test, I mean, a lot of folks who would face disproportionate punishment and be subject to unfair legal procedures would not be able to be granted refugee status. So I think, yeah, there's definitely that factor, and I think there's sufficient information, I would say, which would counter any claims that it's an internal issue, right? And yeah, it wouldn't be in that jurisdiction, right? So let's say they were to go to Australia, they would be definitely they would be applying international human rights standards to what's in India. So that depends from the government they try. I don't think, but I'd be really curious. So the cases which I drew from are, yeah, I haven't been looking at the databases, I think, in the last few months, because there don't seem to be many new cases coming up from India with different profiles from whatever I can gather. But I'm curious, sort of, eventually when international travel resumes, what the situation is going to be like, because I do see more profiles emerging.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a short comment and a question. The
Yes.
comment is relating to Pratha's question. To me, it's been always very curious about how people even try to seek asylum, how people travel to seek asylum, and just wanted to share with you that I met someone a few months ago who said that he was going to study LLM at the Central European University, and he's from Kashmir, and he'd applied last year, but the Hungarian government rejected his visa and gave him a written reason saying that we are fearful that if you reach Hungary, you'll apply for asylum. So he could not go to even study, and this is what we would call, I mean, he was going through a legal route, right? He was not taking a boat, he was not going in the cargo hold of a plane, he was trying to migrate legally, and he was not allowed to. That is always quite curious to me. My question relates to what Mohsen, Jagatjeet, and a few others were saying, that CAA is not a refugee law; it is a citizenship law. And within this, as we've had these conversations, about the persecution standard, because we saw that there were, immediately after the CAA came out, there were cases in Uttar Pradesh where people were documented who would eventually be eligible for protection or for naturalization under the CAA. I wanted to ask you, Suraj, and if you could, speak a little bit about how is persecution determined in actual cases? What sort of factors do we see? Because I know of that little UNHCR country fact book, I think that's what it's called. Which, handbook, yeah. So the country handbook, which RST officers refer to a lot. But what do we exactly see? I mean, does UNHCR demand any evidence? Do they require testimonies? Do they require, for example, newspaper clippings? So how would that work out? And if I may, a second part of the question would be, to what extent would India be mandated to follow those kind of evidentiary standards in determining persecution under the CAA?
Okay, so first comment, right? So the person that you encountered, yeah, unfortunately, I think this is the case frequently, right? When you're applying for visas and if you're from particular countries. So, and I would say these regimes, are in effect, right? If you are discriminating against folks who are coming from particular countries, where there is conflict, I would say it's part of a non-entree regime, as Professor Chinni says. To the second part of the question, so it was about how do you determine persecution? So it's tricky, right? Because there's a line between discrimination, right, in many cases, and what amounts to persecution. So there needs to be a certain seriousness to the human rights violations which, are there, right? Seriousness, or there needs to be a systematic sort of nature in it. So you could be discriminated against. Let's say you're an LGBTQ person in India, right? Do you meet that persecution threshold? And often it's tricky, right? Because yes, of course there's discrimination, but is it on a level that you can say that it's widespread enough, that it's a serious or systematic human rights violation? And often you would be drawing from international covenants, right? I think that's sort of the first starting place when we're talking what is the right. So in terms of the evidentiary standards, because I think that was the second part of it, right? When you're talking about persecution, there's a lot of things which do come into play. Look, so as I said earlier, it's really narrative based, but that narrative is shaped by so many different people. So it's not just shaped by the refugee themselves. It's shaped by the decision maker's own perceptions. That's kind of what I wanted to caution you about when we were talking about the Indian claims, right? It is, it is a certain mindset and a certain idea, but the perceptions were there, right? They were definitely there. So if you've got the decision maker, you've got the lawyer, and many refugees aren't familiar with that language of persecution, right? Well-founded fear of persecution, what does that mean, right? So you're fitting that within a particular, that narrative within a particular definition, and then it gets really, really tricky. I think, and then you've got the interpreters as well. So I would say the narrative is the main thing. And in terms of assessing it, this is where credibility comes into play. They need to be consistent in their story, essentially, right? So there needs to be internal consistency in the story, but also external, which is where country of origin information comes into play. So what are, the sources? So for example, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, what are they saying? Though I think those are the easiest places you can go to, but often it'll go as far as intelligence reports, right? So in some countries in the global north, they'll contact their embassy and they'll be like, yeah, this is what they found out about the situation there. So it can get a little bit, it's a varied, it's a range of sources, but it depends what sort of procedure. And I was very curious because the Tharoor bill had a commission, right? So this is not related to the CA, but this is determination, right? And what that would be. And I think that would perhaps, given this is not a refugee law, those standards, I think, let's say if the Tharoor bill went through, I think it would be interesting, right? What standards India would apply, given that comparatively, I think it's not, for example, if you compare it to Pakistan, right? It's a relatively small number. It would really depend how many people were there on this commission, how many, and what their capacity was. I think I've worked in offices where we are clearly understaffed and overwhelmed. And that, for me, where the example which comes to mind is Egypt, right? And you're doing very rushed decision-making procedures, and you're doing 3 cases a day, right? Whereas in New Zealand, you have the luxury of having a 2-day hearing, right? And you can carefully go through the, information and carefully make sure that narrative, as much information as, if you've got a 2-hour interview and someone has got to tell their story with limited evidence, there's going to be issues. And that's why, with refugee law and how it's adopted and implemented, it really depends from country to country. Is it UNHCR who are doing it? Is it the country which is doing it? How much, is it a legal procedure or is it an administrative procedure? Is it a quasi-legal procedure? Do you have lawyers involved? All these factors, I think, would have been really interesting how that would have played out. But I think that was the critique of the bill, that, the implementation, how are you going to go about implementing it? I think there were some concerns already raised in how it was drafted regarding this commission.
Right. Thank you, Suraj. And if any of our participants have more questions, we would love to hear from you. Please raise your hand or just unmute and ask. In case there are no more questions, I'm going to take the liberty to inform you that please write to Suraj and bother him with all of your questions.
Sure.
So we're very interested to hear from everyone. In that case, we would call this lecture to a close. Thank you very much, Suraj, for taking the time and sharing such wonderful insights with us. Since Teams app is not working, any sense an apology.
Please pass my thanks to him.
Yeah, of course. Thank you everyone for attending as well. We'll keep having more of these guest lectures, and we'll write to you when we have them about the dates. Thank you again, Suraj, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.